Very little information has been given regarding the highly anticipated Final Fantasy VII Remake, other than a couple of trailers and some little information given in past articles and interviews. One piece of information has led to tons of division, controversy, and concern throughout the fandom, and that is regarding that the story of Final Fantasy VII is going to be episodic. While I believe this has been taken way out of context, Square has compared the remake to how Final Fantasy XIII was divided into 3 full games to tell its very large story. With the most recent trailer, and the Final Fantasy VII Remake pretty much guaranteed to be Square's main focus at the upcoming E3, I want to try and break down the story of Final Fantasy VII and predict how it will be broken up into multiple parts that actually make sense from a narrative perspective. With this, I hope this will convince you why, despite the footage we've already been shown, that the first game is actually not going to end at the end of Midgar, but go far beyond, and that the remake will actually be split into 2 games instead of 3. Now, I need to make sure that I'm very clear. This is based on the original story and what little information we'd already been given and what little footage we've been shown. I'm well aware that Square has said that they do plan on making changes to update the story for modern times. So this analysis is based, again, on the original story, so take it as you will. Oh, and it really does go without saying, but just to cover all my bases, this is going to contain major spoilers for the plot of Final Fantasy VII ahead. But if you haven't already played the game, you either already know, and if not, then this isn't the video for you. Okay, one last thing before we dive on in. I want to remind everybody of that awesome subscribe button. Now I know that you've probably been asked this thousands of times from other people, but it really does help this channel grow, and it lets me know the type of content that I should continue to make. So hit that subscribe button and click that bell so you'll know when videos like this come on out. Now that that's out of the way, let's go ahead and dive on in and take a close look at the game's story and see how the game will be split into 2 parts. In all cases, stories are broken up into several parts known as acts. These acts help writers put basic moments at certain points in the plot to help progress the story along and keep things moving at a decent pace. For those of you that are unaware of how a 3-act structure works, I'll go over it here. If you already know, go ahead and skip to the timecode shown on the screen. Let's go ahead and break down the 3-act structure. The first act, known as Act 1, is the start of a story and helps set up the characters in the world. This is normally really short and broken into 2 main parts. The first part introduces you to the world. Here we see what is considered normal to the characters, or the status quo. This is the everyday life of the characters, something that they're used to, their everyday mundane, or in some cases not mundane, tasks. It's what they perceive as the norm. Shortly after this point, something happens that mixes up what is normal to the characters and reveals the problem that needs solving for the overall story. This is known as a catalyst, or the inciting incident, and gives the main characters an issue, something they must do in order to move forward into Act 2. It's important to know that Act 1 doesn't always end right after the inciting incident, but puts the initial punch into the story. The second act, known as Act 2, starts up a little after the inciting incident and is the longest part of the story. This is where all the meat and goodies of a story are located. This is also where we start to see characters grow and try to solve the problem that was presented to them in Act 1, and tends to slow the pace down a little bit from the amount of buildup that we saw in the previous act. Act 2 is typically broken up into 4 parts, but can be more or less depending on the complexity of the story, the characters, and overall length. One of the components of Act 2 consists of the first major obstacle the characters must overcome and raises the stakes. This can be boiled down to meaning that there's no turning back and has a good chunk of exposition in it. This can also happen multiple times throughout Act 2 and build upon each other. The next point is often referred to as the midpoint and leads to the first pivotal moment of the story and exits around the lowest part of Act 2. This can also parallel or be a direct opposite of the final confrontation of the overall story. This is the point in which characters are either at their absolute highest or absolute lowest. One of the other components of Act 2 are things like subplot and character development. All of this help build tension leading up to the end of the second act. The final part of Act 2 is known as the main culmination and sets up the final act of our story. This starts the climb of our final climax. We start to see new tension and new resolve for our main characters. Finally, we have our third and final act, known as Act 3, and is broken up pretty much into 2 main parts. The start of Act 3 is often very quick, establishes the exposition from previous acts, and can often contain a huge twist. This is the revealing moment of the main bad, or where we see all of the clues come together. Now our characters have all the pieces and understanding that the stakes are at the highest they can be. Finally, we have the climax and resolution. We see everything come to a head, and our characters finally confront the main problem of the story. This can end either positively or negatively for our characters, but nothing is more intense than this moment in our story. Afterwards, we have the resolution of our story, and our characters have a new status quo. This 3-act structure is used almost in all modern forms of storytelling, and even in TV series where there is an overarching 3-act structure during the entire season, with each individual episode having its own self-contained 3 acts. Now, after knowing how the 3-act structure is built, you might be able to already see where certain story points may be located within the structure. Furthermore, this will help explain how 2 games suits the story better over 3. Now, the most common way of thinking of breaking up Final Fantasy VII would be to make each act its own game. But that won't work here, and once we break down the story, I think you'll agree. Let's find out where Act 1 starts and ends by looking at the first few hours of the game. Obviously, Act 1 opens up with the iconic bombing mission. We see all our characters working together to blow up Mako Reactor 1. We are introduced to Cloud, Barret, and the rest of Avalanche. After you set the bomb and escape, you go on another mission. On your second mission, you get caught and fall into a church where you meet Aerith. After she convinces you to be your bodyguard, you take her home, then later to the Wall Market, where you meet Tifa, save her from a sexual predator, and learn Shinra's going to flatten Sector 7 and blame it on Avalanche. You try to save Sector 7 and fail. In the process, Aerith gets kidnapped, and you have to storm Shinra Tower to save her. You get caught, put in prison, then escape to go and confront the president of Shinra, only to find him dead with a sword sticking out of his back. Both Cloud and Tifa recognize this sword, and we learn that this sword belongs to Sephiroth. You play a really fun set piece involving a motorcycle minigame, and Cloud resolves to find Sephiroth and confront him to get answers. Now, most people may think Act 1 ends at the second reactor when you plan to blow up the reactor fails. However, this isn't right. Everything leading up to the escape at Shinra Tower is simply the status quo for our characters. This is the norm. This is what they are used to doing. The way that all the characters react to everything in Midgar, while extreme and often flashy, we aren't seeing anything that really progresses our characters and overall plot. Yes, you can argue that Sector 7 being destroyed and Aerith being kidnapped are huge events. Cloud is still a mercenary, Barret and Tifa are still eco-terrorists, and Aerith is still a damsel in distress and a main focus of Shenron, which has been that way her entire life. Our enticing incident, our catalyst that shakes up the very foundation of our characters, doesn't happen until we find the president of Shenron dead and our main problem is introduced: Sephiroth. This means that the first 2 to 3 hours of Final Fantasy VII and all of Midgar is merely everything leading up to the introduction of the main conflict, our inciting incident. And think about it. This section of the game is really your tutorial. You learn how to manage materia, weapons, items, you learn about exploration, you learn about side quests, all in a very linear way. So when the world opens up to you, you are now fully equipped to handle what's ahead. This is why, even if they add a lot of content to the first part, it would be a huge mistake if the first game only happened in Midgar. You would be talking about taking 2 to 3 hours of the first part of the game and stretching it to 40 to 60 hours, and we would never reach the entire reason for the main story until the very end of the game. Think about it, that's 38 to 48 hours of added original story content. That's almost an entirely new game. I don't think that that's going to happen. And we're still not even finished with the first act of the original story. The end of Act 1 doesn't happen until we get through Cloud's story of his history with Sephiroth in the Nibelheim flashback after meeting the entire party in Calm. This builds up Sephiroth and lets us know how much of a threat he is, bringing Act 1 to its conclusion. Everything is set up here. We know who Sephiroth is, and we know what he's capable of doing, and we know the threat that he imposes. Now, we start Act 2 by catching a chocobo and crossing a march with a giant freaking snake. We then head off to a town called Junon where we give CPR to a little girl and sneak onto a carrier ship headed for a new continent on the other side of the world. While we're on this trip across the ocean, things go crazy. Soldiers die, we fight a piece of Genova, and see Sephiroth alive and well. This would be the first major obstacle for our characters to overcome, as this now means that there is no turning back, because we now have confirmation that Sephiroth is alive and searching for the Promised Land. Everything between here and the Temple of the Ancients is character development and party building, so let's recap this quickly. We arrive at Costa del Sol, enjoy the beach, talk to Hojo, and start to chase the rumors of a black coat figure traveling through the mountains. So we go through the mountains, get some backstory on Barrett, and go to the happiest place in the world. While we are there, we get blamed for murder and sent to a desert prison and finish Barrett's backstory. We get out, have some optional cutscenes, and head through a canyon where our 6-wheeled buggy conveniently breaks down. We learn about the planet and how important it is to the story, and get to witness one of the best FMVs of the 90s. Shortly after, we have some Red 13 development, then we're on our way again. Next, we show up in Nibelheim that hasn't actually been burned down. We find Sephiroth, who asks us for about a reunion before running away, and we head through yet another mountain pass. The party then travels to a town with a freaking rocket in the center of it, and we get to meet one of the best Sids of any Final Fantasy. We learn that both Sephiroth and Shinra are headed to the Promised Land, and Shinra wants to beat him to it. We fight a fat dude before escaping on a tiny plane that conveniently breaks down and can only be used as a boat. Okay, now to kind of jump back into the story with a little bit more focus. We then learn that we need to go to the Temple of the Ancients, so what do we do next? That's right, we go back to the happiest place on Earth. Conveniently, the owner has the key, so we get it from him. Also conveniently, the gondola that takes us out of the gold saucer has broken down, so we have to stay at the hotel. We have some touching scenes and find out that Kate Sith, or Ketchi, I don't know how that name's supposed to be, is a spy and steals the key that we just obtained. But our party doesn't really seem fazed and heads to the temple anyway. We get to the Temple of the Ancients and find out Sephiroth is already there, who divulges his major plan, to summon Meteor using the black materia so that the planet can heal itself and Sephiroth can absorb all of the energy that the planet uses. Our heroes get the black materia to only have it given to Sephiroth by Cloud, raising questions and doubt in both the player and Cloud, yet again building tension and asking more questions than answering. Aerith runs off to stop Sephiroth alone by praying to the planet, but of course, we chase after her. We find her and then everyone witnesses the saddest moment in video game history. Sephiroth kills Aerith. While in tears, we fight and kill Jenova Life. This is the midpoint of our story. At this very moment, we have reached the last no turning back point. Aerith is dead, and everything suddenly becomes extremely personal for our entire team. From here on out, the story slowly starts to pick back up. After we wipe away our tears, we chase Sephiroth to a northern crater and have to climb a glacier to get there. There we fight Jenova Death and finally meet Sephiroth, who shakes our very foundation. Cloud, once again, gives Sephiroth the black materia. Then the crater erupts, spewing out a large light. Several monsters called weapons appear, and Cloud disappears. We wake up 7 days later as Tifa and find out there is a meteor in the sky that will destroy the planet. There are giant monsters terrorizing the world, and Cloud is MIA. We escape a public execution and search for Cloud, who's found comatose in a town called Mydeal. Tifa chooses to stand by his side, and the player is now given control of Cid. We do some huge materia gathering, then go check on Tifa and Cloud. A weapon shows up, destroying the town, and both Tifa and Cloud fall into the livestream. Here's where we piece together Cloud's past, and get some much-needed exposition to fill in all the gaps. When they come up, the player is back in control of Cloud, and there's only one thing left to do: stop Sephiroth. This brings Act 2 to a close, and starts up Act 3. We start off Act 3 by finish collecting the huge materia and figure out what Aerith's plan was when she went off to stop Sephiroth alone. Her goal? To summon a Holy to protect the planet from Meteor. After this final revelation, we get all the pieces to the puzzle and understand how to truly stop Sephiroth. Shinra takes one last stab at stopping Sephiroth at the cost of the planet's energy by firing a giant cannon at the northern crater. At this point, the tension has been escalating as we eliminate the first antagonist while giving us a means to stop Sephiroth, since Shinra succeeded in destroying the barrier that's protecting him. With Shinra out of the way, we run straight into the final climax. We travel down the northern crater, defeat the final version of Jenova, and fight Sephiroth. The climax doesn't come to a full conclusion until Cloud fights off what is left of Sephiroth's control in his mind. Once we beat Sephiroth, our resolution starts. Meteor falls, and just before it hits, Aerith's plans comes to fruition, and we watch as the Earth is saved by the livestream having answered Aerith's prayer. And that is the original story of Final Fantasy VII, broken up into 3 acts. Now, where do we break them up into separate games? And can we truly get 3 games out of this? Or would 2 make more sense? We already know Part 1 can't end when we leave Midgar, as our main bad hasn't even really been set up, and making a switch in bad guys at the start of the second game really wouldn't make the first game feel like it's a part of the overall story. It would feel more like its own separate individual game. Not to mention they would have to add an entire game's worth of original content in order to make that first game. My original thought was that the story would be broken up into 3 parts, and having Part 1 end where Cloud goes missing, Part 2 we'd spend the entire game as Tifa and Cid, kinda like how Final Fantasy XIII 2 had you play as Sarah, and Part 3 would be once you get Cloud back. But again, that would mean that the second and third game would then have to have a lot of additional original story content added. Not to mention the entirety of Act 3 is as short as Act 1, and again, that would be an additional 40 plus hours of brand new original content to be added to the story. So that just doesn't work. No matter how I looked at it, splitting the story into 3 parts would just be too difficult, as there are only a few spots in the story where the pacing would actually make sense, and some of those spots are way too close together and would require a ridiculous amount of added content. Then I heard a rumor that came out recently after the main trailer dropped at Sony's State of Play, saying that the game would be split into 2 games instead of 3. And that got me thinking, that makes a lot more sense. So let me break down how each of these would work in their own individual 3 acts. In the first game, Act 1 would still be the same as the original. Escape Midgar and learn about Cloud's past. After that, the first half of Act 2 would still be the same. We meet Sephiroth on the cargo ship and have our first major obstacle, then have the subplots of Barret and Red 13. Our midpoint would be in Nibelheim when we confront Sephiroth in the Shinran Manor. This is key because this would be considered a failure, as they are unable to stop Sephiroth, and Cloud is just as confused as everybody else and feels helpless to stop him. This is also very important as Cloud starts to question what's happening, since the last time he and Tifa remember Nibelheim, it was burnt down, and now everything seems okay as if it never happened. All of this is very important as it foreshadows the conclusion of this first game. The conclusion of Act 2 would then be after we recruit Cid and get the Tiny Bronco. Act 3 starts off with all the events of the Gold Saucer, then heading to the Temple of the Ancients, as this would be its rising action. The climax of Act 3 would then be the death of Aerith, having Jenova Life as the final boss. The resolution then is burying Aerith and Sephiroth getting away. This sets up the first game as a tragedy and would leave players with the emotional trauma of losing Aerith that would only help players want to play the next part, while giving players time to recover from Aerith's death, building up the anticipation and hatred of Sephiroth while we wait for Part 2. The breakdown of Part 2 would have Act 1's inciting incident being Sephiroth summoning Meteor and us losing Cloud. Act 2's midpoint would be getting Cloud back, foreshadowing how Cloud has become his own person and overcoming Sephiroth's control. Finally, the start of Act 3 would be the raid on Midgar, and the game's conclusion being the group defeating Sephiroth, followed by Cloud defeating Sephiroth in his mind. When you try to fit that 3-act structure into any smaller segments, it just doesn't really work. The emotional impact of Aerith dying would be lost if it happens at the start or the middle of any game, and the pacing of it would just be too weird. This also marks the halfway point of the game, meaning that the game would be perfectly split right down the middle. There also just isn't enough content left if they break it into any smaller segments. They would have to stretch out and add a lot of original story content over the course of 3 games. This would most likely lead to 2 full games of original content added to the original story of Final Fantasy VII, and the original story of Final Fantasy VII would be completely lost, and you couldn't even call it Final Fantasy VII anymore. Now, I know some of you are thinking that from the recent trailer, the reveal of Sephiroth looks like he's in Midgar and would leave you to believe that this introduction would mean that Part 1 is only going to be in Midgar, as they would need to set up Sephiroth in order to make it make sense. But I don't think that's the case. I believe that this is just after the Sector 7 plate falls, where Cloud walks off from Barret and Tifa and remembers what Sephiroth said about the Ancients. Now, it's only speculation, but I think that it triggers something in Cloud, and he has a hallucination. This makes sense because in that area you can kind of see the street area that's been destroyed not too far from Sector 7, and these 2 scenes kind of add up and make sense. Since everything is spoken, it's kind of hard to just do a dip to black and have some text, because at this point in the original story we didn't know who Sephiroth was, so we didn't have a voice to it, but now that everything's voice acted, they might have added the character in order to make a little bit better of a connection. I do believe that we will not see Sephiroth's face until much later in the game when we see him in the flashback in Calm. I do believe that that's the case here, and does help support the idea that the first game is not going to end in Midgar. And again, if it did, they would have to add a ton of original story content in order to make it a full game. And that doesn't make any sense, because we would be essentially getting an entirely brand new game with a brand new story. Well, that's my thoughts and analysis of the story of Final Fantasy VII and how I believe the remake's parts will be broken up based on the original story structure. Do you agree, or do you have another thought or opinion? With E3 2019 right around the corner, we will definitely find out more info as Square is all but confirmed that the Final Fantasy VII Remake will be their main focus at the event. And finally, if you liked this video, go ahead and give it a like and consider subscribing. I plan on following the remake very closely as we get more news and info leading up to its release. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really do appreciate you sticking around until the very end, and it really does mean a lot to me. Alright guys, I really appreciate you, and as always, keep it classy.